Mrs. Johnson sat at the bus stop, feeling out of place in a world that seemed to have forgotten her. The morning sun was bright, casting long shadows on the pavement, but the warmth did little to ease her growing discomfort. Her frail hands gripped the edges of the wooden bench, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked around, trying to recognize something familiar, but everything seemed to blur together in a confusing mix of shapes and colors. She wasn't sure where she was or how long she had been sitting there. All she knew was that she needed to get somewhere home, perhaps. The thought of home should have felt comforting, but now it only filled her with uncertainty. The faces around her seemed so unfamiliar, and her mind kept slipping in and out of focus. She felt as though she were invisible, surrounded by a bustling world that paid no attention to her. The street was busy. People hurried by, all of them focused on their destinations. A woman in a business suit walked past, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. A man in a gray jacket glanced at Mrs. Johnson briefly, then quickly turned away, his eyes not quite meeting hers. A few more people passed, but none of them stopped. None of them seemed to notice the elderly woman sitting alone, her eyes glazed over with confusion. Mrs. Johnson's heart sank as she tried to gather her thoughts. Where had her family gone? Why couldn't she remember what she was supposed to do? A sense of panic began to creep in, but she tried to push it away. She took a deep breath, hoping to calm herself, but the busyness of the world around her only made her feel more lost. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the bus she had been waiting for still hadn't arrived. She glanced down at her hands, trying to focus on something familiar. Her nails were chipped, and the skin on her hands seemed thinner than it had been before. She tried to remember when she had last seen her daughter, or maybe it was her son. Had they left her here to wait? Or had she simply wandered off by herself? She couldn't tell anymore. The faces of her children had faded in her mind, and the names didn't come easily to her. As Mrs. Johnson sat there, the noise of the city felt far away, as though she were trapped in a bubble, disconnected from everything happening around her. She stood up briefly, trying to get a better view of the street, but the moment she took a step, her legs wobbled beneath her, and she had to steady herself on the bench. Her vision blurred again, and she felt dizzy. She looked around for help, but no one seemed to notice her struggle. The bus finally arrived, its doors opening with a hiss of air. People began to board, each one quickly slipping past her without a word or a glance. Mrs. Johnson felt a pang of loneliness shoot through her chest. She was invisible to them, just another face in the crowd. She wanted to ask them if the bus would take her home, but she didn't know how to explain it. She didn't even know if she could remember the name of the street where she lived. What if the driver didn't let her on? What if she didn't make it back to where she belonged? She hesitated, standing at the edge of the bus platform, unsure of what to do. The doors of the bus stayed open for a moment, and she had a fleeting sense that maybe this was her chance. But as she took another step forward, she faltered again, the uncertainty of it all weighing down on her. She looked down at her purse, rummaging through it in search of her bus pass, but the more she searched, the more confused she became. She had always been so organized: her bus pass, her keys, her wallet all neatly packed in her bag. But now, everything felt jumbled and out of place. Her hands shook as she tried to zip her purse back up, but it wouldn't close. It wasn't the purse that wouldn't close, it was her mind. She couldn't remember where she had put the bus pass, and it made her feel even more lost. With a sigh, she let the purse drop to her lap. She glanced around again, hoping someone might see her, might ask if she needed help. But the people kept moving. The world kept moving, and she was left behind, caught in the confusion of her thoughts and the strange feeling that she didn't belong here, at this bus stop, in this moment. She was just a shadow among the living, a forgotten woman in a world that didn't have time for her. The noise of the bus and the conversations of the people around her faded into the background. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to remember what she was supposed to do next. But the memory slipped away, like water running through her fingers. She opened her eyes again, hoping for something to change, for someone to notice her. But the bus doors closed with a soft thud, and it rumbled away, leaving her standing there, still unsure of where she was or where she was supposed to be. Mrs. Johnson stood there, lost in a sea of strangers. The hum of the busy city felt like an endless noise that pushed against her, making her feel even smaller, more invisible. She tried to focus, tried to think of where she had to go, but her mind was a blur, like a puzzle with pieces scattered everywhere. She tried to remember her daughter's face, but it was hard. The more she searched for the pieces of her memory, the more they slipped away, leaving her empty. The people around her continued their routines, rushing past her without a second thought. A man in a blue jacket glanced at her for a brief second, his eyes quickly moving away as he checked his watch. A mother holding her child didn't even look down when she passed. There were so many people, yet she felt so alone. It wasn't just the crowd. It was the feeling of being unnoticed, like she didn't matter anymore. It wasn't new, but today, the loneliness felt heavier than usual. The day seemed to grow darker in her mind as she stood there. She glanced at the bus schedule again, though she knew it wasn't going to help. The times were blurry, and the names of the streets seemed unfamiliar. She stared at the list of stops, trying to find one that looked familiar. Was her stop on the list? Or had she missed it? The confusion swirled like fog, making it impossible to see clearly. She needed to get home. Home, where was home? The thought made her feel a little more frightened. She wasn't sure where home was anymore. Was it the little house on Maple Street? Or was it somewhere else, somewhere she had forgotten? It felt like she was chasing shadows, always just a little bit behind. With a soft sigh, Mrs. Johnson tried to remember the details of her life. She could picture parts of it, flashes of faces and moments that had once been so clear, but now they seemed distant, like the echo of a dream. She had children, yes. A daughter, maybe two. And a husband, or had she been married? The details swam away from her each time she tried to hold onto them. She needed help. She needed someone to notice her. She wanted to call out, but the words didn't come. She felt like she was shouting, but no sound escaped her lips. It was as if she were frozen in place, unable to reach out to the world around her. All she could do was wait and hope that someone, anyone, would stop and see her. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, trying to keep the chill away. The bus stop bench felt cold against her legs. She had been sitting here for what felt like hours. Her knees ached, and her back was sore. Her head was heavy, and it felt like there was a weight pressing down on her chest. She just wanted to be home, to be somewhere familiar, somewhere safe. But there was no way to find that safety on her own. She needed help, but where was it? As if by instinct, Mrs. Johnson stood up again, her legs shaky beneath her. She knew she needed to find the right bus, but she didn't know which one to take. She shuffled a few steps forward, trying to gather herself. But as she moved, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She grasped the pole next to the bench for support, trying to steady herself. Her vision blurred again, and she closed her eyes for a moment, hoping the world would stop spinning. When she opened her eyes, she noticed a boy standing nearby, looking at her. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, and his expression was kind but curious. Mrs. Johnson had seen many faces today, but this one was different. This boy didn't hurry past her or ignore her like everyone else. He was watching her closely, his eyes soft and full of concern. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to say. She wanted to tell him that she needed help, but the words seemed so far away. She wanted to ask him where the bus was going, but her mind couldn't seem to form the question. Instead, she just stood there, feeling a little lost, a little afraid, not knowing what to do. The boy took a step closer, his eyes never leaving her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice soft but steady. Mrs. Johnson blinked, the question catching her off guard. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. He wasn't rushing past her. He wasn't ignoring her. He was looking at her as though he saw her, as though he truly cared. I I don't know where I am," she said slowly, her voice shaking. The words came out in a whisper, but it felt good to say them aloud. She felt a little lighter, a little less alone. The boy nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "It's okay," he said with a small smile. "I can help you." Mrs. Johnson blinked again, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Help? He wanted to help her? A boy, so young, was offering his help to her, an old woman who couldn't remember the last time someone had offered to help her without hesitation. She felt a rush of gratitude, but also a little disbelief. How could he possibly help her? What could he do? But the boy seemed confident. He didn't hesitate. "Where do you need to go?" he asked, his voice calm and sure. "I need to go home," Mrs. Johnson replied, her voice wavering. "But I don't know how." The boy's expression softened, and he took a step closer to her. "I can help you get home," he said, his voice full of determination. "We'll figure it out together." For a moment, Mrs. Johnson just stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how this boy would help her, or even where she was going, but something about him made her feel safe. It was the first time in hours that she felt like someone cared. The weight on her chest lightened, just a little, as she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone after all. Without saying another word, the boy reached out his hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's go." Mrs. Johnson looked down at his hand, and after a brief moment of hesitation, she reached out and took it. His grip was warm and steady, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness she had been feeling. The world around her felt a little less overwhelming now, a little more manageable. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. Malik, the young boy, stood in front of Mrs. Johnson with a look of determination in his eyes. He had offered his help without hesitation, and though Mrs. Johnson was still unsure of how this would all unfold, there was something about his presence that felt reassuring. She had no idea how this little boy was going to help her, but his calm voice and gentle demeanor made her feel, for the first time in hours, that she wasn't completely lost. Mrs. Johnson hesitated for a moment longer, her grip still tight around her purse. She glanced down at Malik's outstretched hand, unsure whether to take it. He wasn't much older than her grandson, but there was something about him that made her feel like she could trust him. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand in his. "Thank you," she whispered softly, unsure if he could even hear her. Malik gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's no problem," he said, his voice still calm and steady. "I'm happy to help." The world around them seemed to fade a little as Malik led Mrs. Johnson away from the bus stop. He moved at a slower pace, matching her steps, making sure she didn't stumble. She appreciated his patience. It felt good to walk alongside someone who wasn't rushing her, someone who was willing to take their time. As they walked down the sidewalk, Mrs. Johnson couldn't help but glance around, still feeling out of place. The streets were filled with people going about their business, but none of them seemed to notice the elderly woman walking with a young boy. There was a strange emptiness in her heart as she realized that, even though she was with Malik, she still felt distant from the world. But then, she looked down at the boy's face again. His eyes were focused, not on the world around them, but on her. He was paying attention to her, offering her something that no one else had all day, care and attention. For a brief moment, Mrs. Johnson felt a wave of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Do you know where you live?" Malik asked, breaking her from her thoughts. Mrs. Johnson's brow furrowed as she tried to remember. She had lived in the same house for years, yet now it felt so distant, so unreachable. The name of the street didn't come to her right away. She bit her lip, trying to force the memory back into focus. Her fingers tightened around Malik's hand, the small bit of comfort he was offering her helping to ground her. It's a house," she said slowly, the words coming out haltingly. On the street with the tall trees." Malik nodded, not showing any sign of impatience. He didn't rush her, didn't make her feel bad for not remembering. "Do you know if it's far from here?" he asked kindly. Mrs. Johnson looked up, trying to make sense of the city around her. She had always known this neighborhood, had walked through it countless times before. But now, everything seemed unfamiliar, like a foreign place. The street names, the buildings, even the trees, they all felt so far away. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice tinged with frustration. She had always been so sure of herself. She had always known where she was and where she needed to go. But now, it seemed like her mind was slipping away, piece by piece. She felt a heavy sadness wash over her, the loss of her own memory feeling like an unbearable weight. But then, she felt Malik's hand squeeze hers gently. "It's okay," he said. "We'll figure it out together." His words were simple, but they were enough to calm her racing heart. She had been so afraid of getting lost, so afraid that no one would care enough to help her. But Malik was different. He didn't seem to care that she couldn't remember the way home. He didn't seem frustrated or upset. He was just there, walking beside her, offering her the comfort of his presence. They continued walking, taking one step at a time. Malik guided her down the street, keeping a watchful eye on her to make sure she didn't trip. Mrs. Johnson felt a small sense of relief with each step. The uncertainty of being lost started to fade, replaced by the quiet reassurance of Malik's company. As they walked, Malik spoke to her softly, trying to keep her mind engaged. He asked her about her day, about where she had lived before, about anything that might help jog her memory. Mrs. Johnson did her best to answer, though the details came slowly. She told him about her family, about her children, though the names of her sons and daughters seemed like distant echoes. She tried to describe the house she lived in, but the words wouldn't come together. Malik listened carefully, nodding along even when Mrs. Johnson's sentences didn't make much sense. He didn't interrupt her or make her feel self-conscious. He just let her speak, giving her the space to remember what she could. At one point, they stopped by a street corner, and Mrs. Johnson looked up at a tall building nearby. The shape of it seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. She felt a wave of frustration rush through her again. Why couldn't she remember? Why did everything seem so unclear? Malik noticed her distress and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay," he said again, his voice steady. "We don't have to hurry. We'll take our time and figure it out." The kindness in his voice seemed to ease the tightness in her chest. She looked down at the boy, at his face filled with sincerity, and for the first time all day, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she thought. Maybe, with Malik's help, she could find her way back to where she belonged. "Thank you," Mrs. Johnson whispered, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure what else to say. She wasn't sure how to express the gratitude she felt for this small, quiet act of kindness. But somehow, Malik seemed to understand. They continued their walk, the sounds of the city fading into the background as they moved through the streets together. Mrs. Johnson no longer felt quite so alone. With Malik by her side, the world seemed just a little bit brighter, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like there might be a way home. As they continued to walk down the familiar yet foreign streets, Mrs. Johnson felt a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. Each step she took felt like a small victory, and yet, the doubts still lingered in her mind. The world felt out of focus, and the details of her life seemed just beyond her reach. Malik's steady presence beside her was a comfort, but there were moments when the weight of her confusion threatened to pull her under. She glanced at the boy beside her. His backpack, worn from use, bounced lightly with every step, but his focus never wavered. He looked at her with a quiet kindness that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't rush her, didn't expect anything from her, just walked beside her, offering his company. She wasn't sure what she would have done without him. Malik had asked her a few more questions about her home along the way, but she struggled to answer. The more she tried, the more she realized how little she actually remembered. A name, a street, even the layout of her own house, everything seemed hazy, like a painting smudged with too many colors. She felt embarrassed but didn't want to burden Malik with her confusion. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, but now, everything felt different. "Are we close?" she asked quietly, her voice uncertain. She didn't even know if she was asking the right question. All she knew was that she wanted to be home, but she didn't know where that was anymore. Malik stopped walking for a moment and turned to face her. "We'll get there," he said, his words full of confidence. "Don't worry. We're making progress." Mrs. Johnson smiled weakly. She wanted to believe him, but the nagging doubts in her mind wouldn't go away. She felt like she was chasing a memory that kept slipping through her fingers. Even with Malik by her side, there were moments when the world felt too big and too confusing. As they walked, Mrs. Johnson's thoughts drifted to her family. She thought of her children. Where were they now? Had they been looking for her? Or had they forgotten about her too? The thought made her chest tighten. She hadn't meant to forget things, hadn't meant to become someone who needed help. It felt like a betrayal, like she was losing pieces of herself, and she wasn't sure how much more she could lose. Malik must have sensed her shift in mood. Without saying a word, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder, a simple but meaningful gesture. Mrs. Johnson looked at him, her eyes softening, and she could see the kindness in his expression. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was just kindness, pure and simple. "Do you like to play games?" Malik asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Mrs. Johnson looked at him, surprised by the change in topic. "Games," she repeated, a little confused. "Yeah. I like playing chess," Malik said, his face lighting up. "I'm really good at it. My dad taught me when I was younger." "Do you know how to play?" Mrs. Johnson thought for a moment. She had played chess years ago, when her children were younger. They used to sit around a table on rainy afternoons, playing game after game. But that felt like a different life, a life that didn't belong to her anymore. Still, she nodded. "I used to play," she said softly. "But it's been a long time." Malik smiled. "Well, maybe when we get home, we can play together. I'm sure you'd be great at it." His words were light, playful, and Mrs. Johnson couldn't help but smile. For a brief moment, the weight of her confusion lifted, replaced by a sense of warmth. It was such a small thing, a simple conversation about a game, but it reminded her of who she used to be. It reminded her of the times when she could laugh, when she didn't have to worry about forgetting. As they continued walking, Malik began talking about his school and his favorite subjects. He spoke with such enthusiasm that it made Mrs. Johnson feel lighter. She didn't know how much of his conversation she fully understood, but the way he spoke with such passion made her feel like she mattered. Like she was part of something again. It was only when they reached a corner that Mrs. Johnson began to recognize the area around her. She looked up at the street signs, trying to make sense of them. And then, she saw a sign that said Maple Street. Her heart skipped a beat. She had been right. She was close to home. This was her neighborhood, the place she had lived for years. Mrs. Johnson's face brightened. I think this is it, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and relief. She pointed to the street ahead. I think my house is just down this way. Malik looked over at the street sign and then back at her, his eyes filled with excitement. See? We found it. I told you we'd get there. Mrs. Johnson felt a rush of emotion flood over her. She didn't know how to thank him, how to express her gratitude for the simple kindness he had shown her. He had walked with her through her confusion, never once making her feel less than, never once looking at her with pity. He had treated her like a person, not someone to be avoided or ignored. As they continued down the street, Mrs. Johnson's heart swelled with a feeling she hadn't had in a long time: hope. She might not have remembered everything, but she remembered this: kindness, connection, and the feeling of being seen. Malik had reminded her that even in the darkest moments, there was still light to be found. They reached her house at last, and Mrs. Johnson paused in front of the familiar door. It was small, but it was hers. She could see the garden that her husband had planted years ago, the same flowers she used to tend to every spring. The sight brought a flood of memories back, good memories. She took a deep breath, feeling more at peace than she had all day. Thank you, Malik, she said softly. I don't know what I would have done without you. Malik smiled up at her, his eyes sparkling with a quiet pride. I'm glad I could help. Mrs. Johnson's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of relief. She had been lost, but now, thanks to this boy, she had found her way back. It was a small miracle, but a miracle nonetheless. Goodbye, Mrs. Johnson, Malik said, turning to walk away. Maybe we'll play that chess game sometime. Maybe, she whispered back, her heart full. She watched him walk down the street, his backpack bouncing as he went. She didn't feel alone anymore. In that moment, surrounded by memories and the kindness of a young boy, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: home. Mrs. Johnson stood at her front door, her hand resting lightly on the worn wooden frame. She felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had made it. She had found her way home, not just to the house she had lived in for so many years, but to herself in a way. She could feel the familiar warmth of her home surrounding her, but it wasn't just the walls and the furniture that made her feel safe. It was the kindness she had been shown, the kindness of a young boy who had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else had. Her heart swelled with gratitude. She could feel tears gathering in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of thanks, of relief, and of the unexpected comfort that Malik had brought into her life today. She had been lost, adrift in a world that felt unfamiliar and cold, but he had been her anchor. As she stood there, a faint breeze ruffled her hair, and she thought of her family. Where had they been all this time? Why had they let her wander out here alone? She had no answers to those questions, and perhaps, she would never know. But for now, none of that mattered. Malik had helped her when no one else had, and that simple act of kindness had made all the difference. Her thoughts were interrupted as the front door creaked open behind her. She turned around quickly, startled, but then relaxed when she saw her daughter, Claire, standing there. Her daughter's eyes widened in surprise, but then softened when she saw her mother standing there, safe and sound. Mom? Claire asked, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and relief. Where have you been? We've been looking everywhere for you. Mrs. Johnson didn't know how to explain everything that had happened. She could have told Claire about the confusion, about the bus stop and the strange feelings that had filled her head. She could have explained how she had wandered through the city, not knowing where she was going or how to get back. But as she looked into Claire's worried face, she realized something important. It wasn't just about the confusion. It was about the people who were there for you when you needed them the most. And today, it had been Malik who had stepped in when no one else did. "I'm okay," Mrs. Johnson said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She reached out to Claire, pulling her into a warm embrace. For a moment, they just stood there, holding each other. Claire's arms wrapped around her mother, the tension of the day melting away as the two of them shared a quiet, peaceful moment. "Where did you go, Mom?" Claire asked, her voice softer now. She pulled back slightly, holding her mother at arm's length and studying her face, trying to understand. Mrs. Johnson hesitated. How could she explain the kindness of a boy who wasn't even part of her family, but who had helped her in a way no one else had? She thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I didn't go far," she said, her voice filled with a gentle sadness. "I was just lost for a little while. But someone helped me find my way." Claire looked at her curiously, but before she could ask more, Mrs. Johnson's face softened, and she placed a hand on her daughter's arm. "I don't need to talk about it just yet. I'm home now, and that's what matters." Claire nodded, her eyes full of understanding. She could see the change in her mother, the way her shoulders had relaxed, the way she looked just a little bit more at peace. Even though Claire didn't understand the full story, she knew that whatever had happened, her mother was back, and that was all that mattered. As Claire helped her mother inside, Mrs. Johnson couldn't stop thinking about Malik. She hadn't asked for his name, hadn't thought to find out much about him. He had just appeared when she needed him, a small boy offering a hand when the rest of the world had overlooked her. He had been her light in the darkness, and though their time together had been brief, it had meant more to her than she could ever express. Sitting down at the kitchen table, Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath and let her mind wander back to Malik. She could see his face so clearly in her memory, the kindness in his eyes, the way he had held her hand so firmly, as though he believed in her when no one else did. He had treated her like a person, not an elderly woman to be avoided, but a person who mattered. And for that, she would always be grateful. As Claire began to prepare some tea, Mrs. Johnson's mind wandered again to the conversation they had shared as they walked together. Malik had talked about chess, about his love for the game and how his father had taught him to play. Mrs. Johnson smiled at the memory. Chess had been something her husband had enjoyed, too. They had played many games together over the years, sitting side by side at the kitchen table, their laughter filling the room. It had been a part of their life, a part of their story, before the days started blurring together for her. Maybe, she thought, it was time to pick up the pieces again. Maybe it was time to find something that could bring her joy, even in the midst of everything she was going through. Perhaps chess wasn't just a game, it was a way to reconnect with who she had been before Alzheimer's had begun to take hold. Maybe it was a way to remember that even as memories faded, there were still pieces of her life worth holding onto. "Mom." Claire's voice interrupted her thoughts, and Mrs. Johnson looked up to see her daughter standing by the counter with a cup of tea in hand. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Johnson smiled softly, taking the cup from Claire. "I'm more than all right," she said. "I'm home." Claire sat down beside her, and the two of them shared a quiet moment, sipping tea and looking out the window. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Mrs. Johnson felt at peace, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so lost. She thought of Malik again, and a gentle smile spread across her face. The world could be a lonely place, but sometimes, the kindness of a stranger could light the way. And though she would never see Malik again, she would carry the memory of his compassion in her heart forever. As the afternoon light faded and the house settled into quiet, Mrs. Johnson knew that she wasn't truly lost. She might forget the details from time to time, but she would always have the memory of the boy who had helped her find her way back home.